So today I'm talking about business planning, which sounds as dull as ditch water, but honestly it's not. I spoke before about visions and sort of the all-encompassing vision that underpinned every part of a project. Business planning is essentially the plan that comes below the vision. This is how you're going to achieve what you're going to achieve. So from that respect, it's actually pretty exciting. It's all the detail of how you're going to turn that vision into practical reality. So, what is a business plan? So everything that is going to happen in your project, everything foreseeable that's going to happen in your project, very importantly, it's how your outgoings are going to be paid for by your income. Just as a general note, when I'm talking about business planning today, business planning is very much focused on what you do once your building is complete and your project is complete. But for the purpose of today, we're going to talk about business planning as in the beginning of your project and getting it right through to completion and operation, because it's about checking every part of that is viable and deliverable. It reassures your audience that your building will not fall into disrepair again. That's a really important point, and particularly if you're seeking public funding. The idea of a business plan is it's a coherent, sensible document that shows how you're going to make sure your building stays in use. There is no point having a business plan that delivers the world on a plate but is going to be really, really risky, and that's what funders don't want to see. The business plan is a reassuring document that shows that you've thought of every aspect of how your building is going to operate, both in terms of funding the initial project but in operating it post-completion as well. A business plan is a live document. If at the beginning of your project, in your outline business plan, you see things working a certain way, and as your project develops, you realise that isn't viable, sensible, there are other opportunities, you don't stick at a business plan just because it's something you said. Obviously, you need to check that amongst stakeholders, you need to do due process on that, but the business plan is a live document. The saddest thing is when you see fantastic business plans that are just put to one side and not reviewed as time progresses. In that way, they can't be a useful document. And the business plan, I'll talk a bit about how the business plan relates to other documents in your overall project library of documentation. It references the project execution plan, which is your step-by-step guide to governance, to how actually week by week that project is going to work. But really, it's less about the methodology of how it will work, and it's more about the nuts and bolts of how things will be paid for and how they'll stack up. So overall, it's not a dry project at all. It's completely critical to the successful operation of a finished project. In terms of its evolution, going back to the vision again, I mentioned in the vision presentation how everything needs to come back to that vision, and if something doesn't come back to that vision, you need to ask yourself why you're doing it. Of course, that goes for your business plan as well. It takes that very top line vision and begins to put it into reality. As a starting point for your business plan, you have to understand the building you have. Sometimes it can be a need and you're looking for a building to put it into, but I don't think that's so successful. You have to understand the building that you're dealing with, and that could be in the form of a statement of significance. It could be if you're lucky enough to come across a full conservation plan, but either way you need to assign significance to your building and understand what's special about it in order to establish what then it's capable of housing as an ongoing business plan. Once you've got your statement of significance, you need to commission an options appraisal. Now, using that significance as a baseline, the options appraisal begins to marry up what the potential uses could be without harming that significance. It's a good idea to look at a few potential options, even if you know straight away that you've got a natural option, an end user for a building. It's still a good discipline to go through. And again, it's that thing of reassuring funders and external stakeholders that you've really done your homework, that this isn't on the back of a fag packet. This has been looked at really very analytically. Once your options appraisal has been done, you should pretty clearly get a preferred option, which I put here is the best balance between viability and conservation. You could have an option that comes out of an options appraisal that involves massive returns and huge profits all round, wonderful, but if it completely compromises the significance of the building, firstly, it's unlikely to get support from statutory bodies or funders, etc. And secondly, it's going to be very, very damaging to what's important about your building. So your preferred option, best balance between viability and conservation. And then taking that a step further, and this is where we get into business planning, your business plan is a detailed testing of your preferred option, and it includes those critical elements: income and expenditure, a sensitivity analysis, which I'll speak about a bit more shortly, and all the market research that backs up all your assumptions. So if your preferred option is that this is going to be a fantastic business hub and that the area is crying out for start-up business accommodation, the business plan is where all your market research sits that backs up those assumptions. So going back to the beginning and what I said about the statement of significance, there is absolutely no point becoming attached to a preferred option if you haven't first understood what's significant about your building and your building setting as well, critically. You could want to do all kinds of things. For example, if you're looking at an older building with very small rooms in it, there's no point looking at that and saying, well, I want it to be a venue for huge conferences, etc., when the layout of the building just isn't going to work with that end use. So that's just a very extreme example of it, but it's always starting with the building and what the building can tolerate. It could be a statement of significance in the first place. Normally, they're only a side long. They're not huge, long documents. But just as much as your options appraisal evolves into your business plan, your statement of significance will ultimately evolve into your conservation management plan. And the important contribution your conservation management plan will make plugged into the business plan is what those costs are of maintaining your building when it is up and running and operational. Historic buildings quite often do take additional premiums to keep them in good condition, and this quite often can be the reason that the market leaves them behind. So you don't want to be guilty in your own business plan of not attaching a cost to those ongoing maintenance bills and making sure they're reflected in your projections going forwards. The options appraisal, as I mentioned before, it could be that you look at a building and there seems to be a natural end use, and you could look at this and go, well, there's no point doing an options appraisal. We know what we're going to be heading for. But actually, as I said before, it's worth just stepping back and testing that again in an options appraisal. If it's the right use, your options appraisal will take you to that use, just in a quite documented and methodical way. However, you might find yourself surprised and find out something else emerges. We spoke about the nature of the building itself. Does that suggest its own future? For example, if you're dealing with a large Victorian civic building, it could suggest lots of public uses. It will have the capacity. It could be a great performance space with lovely high ceilings. You don't know, but your options appraisal should to build on the statement of significance and look at what might work. Was it been used for before? Not always a good test, because of course whatever it's been used for before hasn't worked out. That's why you've got involved. Is there anything that has to be ruled out? Has anything changed about the area it's now in that means it can't be used for that reason? Is there a likely end user on the horizon? I've said be cautious about jumping straight in and identifying a preferred option, but at the same time, if you do have likely end users, it makes sense to talk to them and consider what their preferred option is. I would consider at least 3 different options for the building's future use. As we've said, consider the physical implications, the layout, the services, which are very, very difficult to introduce into some historic buildings, and management implications. We're not just talking about physically getting these things in there, we're talking about how they're going to be viable and sustainable going into the future, and of course need and demand, going back to that thing about market research. Initial top-line market research that suggests this is a good area in which to do X, Y, Z. The types of end use that you might see in an options appraisal, people always with historic buildings consider visitor attractions. That's fine, but not every historic building is destined to be a visitor attraction, but depending on the location, nature of the building, you may still wish to consider that. Is there a lack of employment in the area or particular economic activity that needs stimulating? Does it need particular types of office accommodation? Going back to the nature of your building, a large Victorian building will suit hot desking and hubs, a smaller building not so much. What makes the location unique? What opportunities are there? Are there local traditions, trades, etc. that could find a home in there? A need for community or office space. Very often a lack of public and community space can be addressed via a project with a historic building. Can you offer parking? Very boring one. Can't dress that one up, but it's an essential consideration when you're looking at what your building can be used for, depending on the transport. If the building is in poor condition, this may be a silver lining to taking on a building that is in very poor condition, is it might have a greater tolerance for change. If you have intrinsically less historic fabric of significance, you may be able to make more dramatic changes in terms of adaptive reuse than if you're looking at something that's pretty much unchanged, in which case that tolerance is much lower. So out of all that, your preferred option will offer the most secure and sustainable future for the building in terms of build cost, need and demand, and ongoing viable operation, but it will also require the least harm to its historic significance and the greatest opportunity to positively enhance the building as well. An historic building project is not just about preserving everything of historic significance, though of course that's the starting point. It's also to do with positively enhancing that in a more modern way. And it should also, in a historic building project particularly, and one that's publicly funded, give the greatest return in terms of wider community and public benefit. Again, going back to that example of a good private sector solution could be housing, for example. That won't necessarily work if you've got public money involved. It doesn't necessarily give the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people, and it might result in greater harm to the historic fabric. So once you've established your preferred option, it's time to start bringing together a business plan to test in further detail how sustainable and viable that preferred option is. All the signs are at options appraisal stage that this is the one. This doesn't harm the building. This has a real chance of meeting a need and demand and therefore being sustainable. The business plan is quite a critical process in terms of the preferred option. First of all, you need to test the viability of funding the delivery phase of the project itself. There is no point if you have this wonderful solution, if it costs £1 squillion and £1 squillion is not available, you have to relook at it or phase it. It should test the need and demand further. You'll already have probed this a little bit, but you need to go that step further to give you greater certainty that the conclusion you've reached is, as far as you can evidence, the correct one. You need to test the operating income and expenditure. So yes, there are figures in here, but they're really critical. And with sensitivity testing, what you're testing is what a percentage decrease on your forecast figures would do to the project, going lower and lower, trying to see how lean it is. If it only takes a 5% decrease to get your project into trouble, you probably need to relook at it. Certainly from a funder's point of view, that's the kind of thing that may concern them. We mentioned before about the conservation management plan and how that outlines the specific maintenance costs and needs of an historic building. You need to take that into consideration and test how your business plan can meet those requirements. And you want to have some testing there of your ability to fundraise the capital works. Of course, you'll have a separate fundraising plan ultimately, but this still needs referencing in the business plan. So quite a lot of work. Who is going to be involved in a successful business plan? It should be owned by the trustees, the keepers of the vision. They own the business plan. They then delegate the delivery of that to various professionals, but ultimately they own it, they own its conclusions, and they are responsible for implementing them. You will, of course, have consulted with your local community if the business plan's to be successful. That could be the people who are geographically close. It could be a community of those who are interested in your building and what you're doing, families, older people, visitors, whomever you see as your end user or as a part in the viability of the project. Statutory consultees, of course, will have a huge opinion. The business plan is developed side by side with the designs as much as it's developed side by side with the conservation management plan. So you have that consultation all the way through. So the aim being that you don't come up with something that ticks every single box apart from your statutory consultees who may decide they don't like it if they're not involved in that process. Funders, of course, funders shouldn't dictate the business plan. They don't own it. However, you will want to consider what their requirements are when you're bringing together the viability of the capital phase, so that you're hitting the right funders and meeting their requirements for their own fundraising purposes and their own outcomes. You probably will need a specialist business planning consultant. It's a good idea to include one, certainly as part of HLF Stage 1 funding. You can include the costs of a business planning consultant who will bring all of this together and carry out some of that dispassionate analysis. And when do you need it? I hope what's come across is that the business plan is an evolution. It starts with the options appraisal. You develop it to a certain point to apply for funding, but that it's a live document and you continuously review it. So options appraisal right at the beginning, so RIBA stages conventionally used for project planning. For pre-development, pre-HLF stage 1, you need that options appraisal really, so you can begin to focus down on what the preferred option will be. An outline business plan based on that preferred option you would hope to submit with any HLF stage 1 application. And then in the development phase, post stage 1 and pre-stage 2, it's all about developing that business plan side by side with the design, side by side with the conservation management plan, side by side with the activity and outreach programme plans. You need to develop those all in conjunction so you get to RIBA stage 3 level of detail with your business plan. You revise it. HLF very sensibly say that a year before you open, you need to start revising your business plan because they know things change, and that's important to recognise, and important not to understand that's a part of the process. It's not a failing, things change and the business plan needs to reflect that. But of course, as soon as your project opens, that isn't time to put the business plan on the shelf. It remains a live document. If things don't pan out in year 1, 2, 3, 5, as they were in the business plan, you revise it all the time and keep it live. So in summary, a business plan, it's the business end of how you're going to achieve your vision. It's objective. You can't get too wedded to a preferred option if that one in the cold light of day doesn't work. It's a live document subject to review. It's based on facts. Again, a preferred option is great. You may know that early on, but a preferred option will still make the cut, if you like, with information behind it as well. And if it doesn't, then perhaps it wasn't going to be the most sustainable outcome for your project in the first place. Ambitious but realistic, they sound contradictory. You've got to be ambitious. You've got to have room to grow within the business plan, but at the same time, not saying growth means growing by 500% in the first 12 months. It's methodical, it follows a pattern, and this is where your business planning consultant will be useful in taking it through those critical stages to get to a robust conclusion at the end, and doing the necessary analysis with the sensitivity analysis, etc., to really get under those figures and as much as possible be confident about the conclusions of the business plan. And of course, it sits alongside the rest of your project documentation with the conservation management plan, the project execution plan, and your designs. I finished off with the vision talk with this final thought, and I'll do it here again, slightly modified. Always ask yourself, when you look at your business plan, is it contributing towards delivering the vision for this project and this completed building? And if the answer is no, you need to change what you're doing and make sure that business plan is completely geared and focused as a live and a useful document that's always driving you towards the achievement of that vision.